hari ini kita kedatangan tamu istimewa ya, yaitu terbang dari Manila, yaitu beliau namanya adalah Tiu Sonco, Tiu Sonco second, ya baik. Is it Tiu Sonco? Jose Tiu Sonco second. Dia merupakan senior lecturer di University of Philippines. Dia berada di departemen atau institusi yang namanya National College of Public Administration and Governance. Jadi University of Philippines itu adalah UI-nya Filipina, gitu ya. Jadi universitas terdepan di Filipina. Dan beliau memperoleh gelar PhD-nya dari Kobe University Jepang. Dan salah satunya karyanya, makanya beliau menjadi pengajar di sesi ini adalah karena beliau akan membahas Intergovernmental Fiscal Relations, ya. Intinya Intergovernmental Fiscal Relations. Jadi dia akan menerangkan mengenai aspek-aspek fiskal dari desentralisasi. Jadi ini merupakan sebuah kesempatan yang berharga bagi adik-adik sekalian dan tentu saja kami sebagai dosen. So, Jose, we would like you to start your presentation. I hope you're ready. Okay, please go ahead.
Good afternoon, everyone. First of all, I'd like to express my appreciation to the management for this opportunity to give a presentation on this particular topic. I happen to work on this research area for the past maybe over 10 years. And decentralization, particularly decentralization reforms and fiscal decentralization, are among the areas that I have been working on at the university and outside of the university, particularly on my dissertation. So I will be sharing with you some of my observations, analysis, and even comparative viewpoints between the Philippines and that of Indonesia. So for the outline, just a brief introduction of where my presentation is coming from. It's more of revisiting. I'm sure that you have had a lot of lectures and presentations on decentralization, as our dean himself has been a key person in decentralization reforms in Indonesia and in Asia Pacific as one of the leading scholars. So I'll just provide a brief introduction on the literature on decentralization, followed by the traditional economic rationale of decentralization and intergovernmental fiscal transfers, the traditional forms, dimensions, and typology of decentralization, attempts at measuring decentralization, and the last two are actually part of the focus that I've been doing in the past 5-6 years. Okay, if you look at the recent literature on decentralization globally, there's been, particularly among political scientists, there has been some criticism against advocates of decentralization pertaining to its impact, and that they say that advocates and critics of decentralization are constrained to generalize the impact of decentralization relative to widely held normative values and principles, including subsidiarity, allocative efficiency, responsiveness to local preferences, interjurisdictional competition, innovation, and experimentation. In your lectures in the classroom, I'm sure you have read the works of Ibo, the traditional economists who have worked on the theory of decentralization since the early 60s and 70s. And these are among the major values in decentralization. And in recent literature, we have seen some criticisms, empirical analysis, trying to challenge the ability or impact of decentralization vis-a-vis these values. For example, Martinez Vasquez and another work of Paul Smoke, they say that cross-country empirical analysis have shown mixed, inconclusive, and generalizable results between decentralization and improved service delivery, accountability, corruption, economic growth, poverty reduction, among others. So there is this emerging literature, empirical analysis, trying to look at the cross-national studies linking decentralization and broad development outcomes. So in this particular presentation, I'll try to offer an alternative approach to understand the process of decentralization at the country level, particularly in this part of the world, by using my case studies, the Philippines and Indonesia, as empirical phenomena. Another study by Paul Smoke pointed out that both sides, both advocates and critics, can find empirical evidence that support what they believe, but there's no consensus on some very broad generalizations about the factors that matter most. Again, another key person in the literature on decentralization, Salmon, pointed out that in relating decentralization with economic growth, he said he is tempted to conclude that there is no relation between the two, meaning decentralization and economic growth universally or cross-jurisdiction. Hence, if confirmed, meaning there is negative relationship, it would preclude general recommendations to decentralize as a way to foster economic growth. So the point here being is that there is a need for more in-depth country analysis in our respective countries, particularly in Asia, on the need to determine and explain the extent to which decentralization reforms have indeed transferred authorities, responsibilities, and resources from central to sub-national level. So when I talk of decentralization here, I'm talking about devolution. So meaning it transfers authorities, responsibilities, and resources down to subnational government. So it's really devolution, not more of the other types such as deconcentration and delegation. Here we're talking about the transfer of authority, responsibility, and resources, not just mere delegation. So these are the traditional economic rationales of decentralization. I'm sure you have read them. Just for our review, Musgrave, Oates, Thibault, as early as the 1950s, Salmon, Britton. Peterson, for example, in 1995 argued that for the functional theory of decentralization or federalism, it has two important functions. One is the developmental function, which pertains to the formulation of policies and programs that provide physical and social infrastructure necessary to facilitate countries' economic growth. Again, this was in the 1995. Another one is to redistribution, which pertains to the equitable reallocation of resources from rich to the poor and the vulnerable sector. So within the context of fiscal decentralization theory, there are three important purposes. One is stabilization, distribution, and allocation. Among its features for stabilization is macroeconomic stabilization, regulation of the types of revenue assignment appropriate at the local level. So part of the role of central government, if you may, as far as stabilization is concerned, is ensuring that by transferring authority for local governments to generate or collect taxes, it will not distort macroeconomic stability. Another is distribution. So as pointed out earlier, it's also part of the process of redistributing national resources to our subnational governments. And the third is on allocation, looking at allocative efficiency, whereby we transfer resources to those that need it most. And usually, the instrument used is through intergovernmental fiscal transfer. So we'll go into that later on. So if you look at the different sources of local government resources, here you look at own source revenues through the taxing authorities given to local governments, and as well as non-tax revenues. Another form of source of revenue for local governments, of course, is intergovernmental fiscal transfers. In Indonesia, I understand it's the DAU and DEK, the general purpose grant and the specific purpose grant. So we'll talk about it also later on. And of course, local governments may be given the authority to borrow from financial and government financing institutions. So essentially, you have three sources of revenues for local governments here that is part of the process of decentralization, meaning transferring authority from central government to local subnational government levels. Talking about intergovernmental fiscal transfers around the globe, it's used as a public finance policy instrument to operationalize fiscal decentralization, particularly in terms of sharing of fiscal resources between central and local governments. It pursues the value of the economic rationale, particularly the values of efficiency and equity arguments. It also offers risk sharing and stabilizing effects between central and local governments. Intergovernmental fiscal transfer is used as a policy instrument to address fiscal needs of states or local governments or influence program design at the subnational government. Of course, grants also have adverse incentive effects, but can also be used to offer intentional incentive effects, meaning the design of intergovernmental fiscal transfers could actually, in fact, have adverse or negative effects. Okay? So, intergovernmental transfers should be designed very carefully so that it will not result in negative adverse effects. However, if designed properly, it could be used to have intentional incentive effects, such as encouraging local governments to support central government programs such as education, health service provision, among others. Okay, as I've said earlier, in the past decade, we have seen that especially among developing countries, where local governments have pretty low resource bases, where they cannot collect enough taxes, it's been argued that reforming intergovernmental fiscal transfers is a critical response to the criticisms to the issues of decentralization globally. Hence, there's a need for a proper design and use of intergovernmental fiscal transfers in a multi-level system of government and should be viewed from a wider political system, according to Oates. According to Anwar Shah, who is also an authority in this topic from the World Bank Institute, he said that a properly designed fiscal transfers should be seen as part of the solution rather than the problem, because at that time, if I remember correctly, policy analysts wouldn't want to touch on particularly at the country level, on the design of existing transfers because it might cause more problems on the existing institutions. But according to Anwar Shah, it should be seen as part of the solution rather than part of the problem in terms of pursuing a proper design. And according to one Japanese economist, a set of ideal set of grants may not be feasible for political reasons. So politics is also part of the process of designing intergovernmental fiscal transfers. We have to consider how to maneuver within our own political systems so that ideal designs could be pursued. At the very least, you can compromise what would improve the current system or status quo if you are in a particular situation where your design of intergovernmental fiscal transfer is not working. Again, if you look at the literature of intergovernmental fiscal transfer, these are among the purposes. First is to simply finance the difference between state or subnational expenditure and revenue-raising responsibility. So being able to address the fiscal gap is one purpose of intergovernmental fiscal transfers from central to local governments. Another is to equalize transfers to compensate for differences in state or subnational fiscal capacities that arise from the decentralization of fiscal responsibilities. So across local governments, you will see variations in terms of fiscal capacities. So it is used to equalize in terms of revenue resources and expenditure responsibilities, particularly in terms of the ability to provide services. The third purpose of intergovernmental fiscal transfer, according to Boldway, is that it allows the state or federal government to exercise influence or oversight over the design of state programs. So it means that central government, through the use of, say, specific purpose grants, they can influence local governments to deliver specific merit goods or services. Okay, so it's used as an instrument so that whatever programs of the central government could also be pursued or supported by local governments at the local government level. So it's an instrument to incentivize, if you may, local governments, subnational governments to follow some general directions of national or central government. Of course, in Asia, for example, we are also facing a lot of challenges in terms of the implementation and design of intergovernmental fiscal transfers. A publication by the Asian Development Bank in 2003-2004 pointed out a number of challenges in the design of intergovernmental fiscal transfers. They include aggregate size of transfers and macroeconomic concerns. Another is the variety and structure of transfers programs, resource allocation, and of course, political and bureaucratic interference. So I will not go into the details, but these are the manifestations of these major challenges confronting countries in Asia that have pursued decentralization. So I think you can easily locate the publication through searching in the internet by looking at the challenges of intergovernmental fiscal decentralization. But essentially, these are three major areas that were identified as being the challenges in implementation, in the design and implementation of intergovernmental fiscal transfers. Okay, there are also practical tips in terms of designing intergovernmental fiscal transfers according to Dr. Anwar Shah, based on his wide experience in this area. Among these include one objective, one instrument for fiscal transfers. Okay? So, according to Anwar Shah, for example, if you have, your objective is to bridge the fiscal gap, it might be appropriate to come up with one particular design of fiscal transfers. If you want to reduce regional disparity, then the general non-matching fiscal capacity equalization transfer is a more appropriate design, so on and so forth. Say, for example, if you want to set a minimum standard, then the appropriate design would be conditional non-matching output-based block grants, or conditional capital grants with matching rate that varies inversely with local capacity. So the point being is that do not mix up the objective of the design and the instrument that you will use. Okay? So according to Dr. Shah, it's one objective, one form of fiscal transfer. So again, it depends on the country context. I think the applicability of this guidance is that if you are in Indonesia, what would suit your specific condition? Same with the Philippines, how should we really design our fiscal transfers? And some criteria for effective formula, according to Jun Ma, and I just made some minor adjustments. First is revenue adequacy, equity and transparency and stability. So these are important criteria in the design. You have to have a resource pool, for example, where you're willing to transfer that to subnational or local governments. Equity is another principle wherein the tendency is to provide more to those with low fiscal capacity in terms of generating revenue. And of course, it has to be transparent and stable. So meaning, in terms of calculating how much a particular local government should get, should be known by a particular local government as well as others. It's very important to know how much you'll be getting from central government so that you can also harmonize it with the plans and programs at the local government level. Okay. Forms, dimensions, and typology of decentralization. I will not go into this. I'm sure you're all aware of this as students of public administration. From the viewpoint of public administration, we're looking at the types of decentralization in terms of deconcentration, delegation, and devolution. But for our purposes today, we're talking about devolution. It's really the transfer of authority, responsibility, and resources from national or subnational to local government level. So it's no longer the concentration, but really decentralization or devolution. And of course, if you look at the literature, actually I just show you very quickly. If you look at the websites of development organizations looking at, say, the dimensions of decentralization, you will see this, so many definitions of political decentralization, administrative decentralization, and of course, fiscal decentralization. Some would even include market decentralization. But again, for our purposes, we'll be using a definition of decentralization which is process-oriented. So we look at decentralization as a state reform of transferring authorities, responsibilities, and resources to the subnational government level. Okay? I will provide you with another set of definitions of decentralization relative to this particular interest, which is looking at decentralization as a process of reform. Okay? Can you follow? You're still with me? So for our purposes, we talk of decentralization as a process of state reform, where we transfer, central government transfers authority, responsibilities, and resources to local governments. So the key word is transfer. So the outcome of interest is really increased local government, subnational government autonomy. So that's the outcome of interest. And I'll provide you with the framework in this particular explanation. So we do not look at actually market decentralization or private sector decentralization because it's no longer part of the state reform. It's going outside of the state structure. But before I go to our definition and framework of decentralization as a process, let me just show you some attempts at measuring decentralization based on the literature that we have. Since the early 2000s, there have been attempts to measure the degree of decentralization. For example, here, the work of Snyder in 2003, you will see attempts at comparing degree of decentralization in terms of political, administrative, and fiscal decentralization, looking at, say, for example, Thailand, Philippines, Indonesia, Malaysia, China, India, and Australia. Just to cite some examples here. Okay? So what can you observe here? This was published in 2003, but I think the data used was in 1996. Okay? So, for example, if you look at Indonesia, in terms of the degree of decentralization, the three types of decentralization, you have not yet engaged in the 1998-1999 Decentralization. Okay, so, but the degree of decentralization here is up to here in terms of the three areas. This is according to the study of Snyder. And if you look at the Philippines, for example, if you look at political, we're almost 100%. One, administrative, almost 50%, and fiscal is below 20%. But again, you will note that this is the source of data actually is time invariant, meaning it's just 1 year across countries. So it does not look at the temporal aspect of the reform process. So it simply compared countries coming from different contexts at one particular period or time, which is 1 year. Okay, so meaning, I think the challenge there is you cannot see the process, the evolution of the reform process as undertaken by one country. Okay? Again, if you look at fiscal decentralization, for example, a study conducted by the UCLG in 2008 and 2010, looking at two measures, for example, the subnational share of expenditure and subnational share of revenue, we will note that here, for example, which countries have the highest subnational share of expenditure and subnational share in revenues. Looking at the study of UCLG, the United Cities for Local Governments, if I'm not mistaken. So look at China, for example, in terms of expenditure share vis-a-vis total government expenditure, 70%. And in terms of revenues, it's about 40%. Whereas the Philippines, here, if you look at revenues, for example, it's about 7%. And if you look at expenditure share, it's about 33%. Again, we don't know exactly the year these countries are being compared. So in terms of variation at the country level, it's a bit challenging to draw comparative analysis. It just gives you a glimpse of where they are in terms of these two variables, but in terms of doing a cross-country analysis as a result of the process of reform, I think there is a need for more information. Okay? You have a question? You still follow? The point being is, based on country studies, individual country cases, these were calculated. But in terms of the year and the source of information, it would require further work in as far as looking at uniformity, if you may, of the sources as well as the year of collection. Japan, for example, 60% in terms of expenditure shared of national government, and 40% in terms of revenue, meaning those that flow to or collected by local governments, vis-a-vis total government revenues. Okay. So I'm just showing you the previous studies conducted. No? Why I'm saying that perhaps there's a need to do more within country analysis of the process of reform in terms of decentralization. Again, the same arguments here. If you look at the upper tier and lower tiers of local governments, again, you will see a lot of variation across countries of study. Okay? But understanding the temporal and aspect of reform, I think it's quite difficult to infer or appreciate. You have questions so far? Sir?
Yes, back to the previous data.
Yes.
What does it mean that the Philippines is more advanced in decentralization compared to other countries?
This one, sir?
Yeah. Compared to Indonesia.
Indonesia.
How do you explain the difference in Indonesia and your country?
Okay, if you compare the two countries, for example, using this study, if you look at the sub-national share of expenditure vis-a-vis total government expenditure, meaning how much local governments are spending at the sub-national level relative to total government expenditure, meaning local and central government at the aggregate level. So here in Indonesia, it's 35%. In the Philippines, it also says 33%. So in this particular data, I don't know the exact year it was collected, but we're saying here that, at least this particular data, that they're almost in the same level. Okay? But in terms of revenues, sub-national share revenue vis-a-vis total government revenues, almost the same. So if you just look at this, it means that effectively we're almost in the same level. But later on I'll show you that it may not be the case as a result of a more temporal analysis of fiscal decentralization and administrative decentralization. Okay? So is that okay, sir?
Compared to Vietnam?
Compared to Vietnam also, Vietnam is, they have a different kind of political system, right? But again, they have a very high expenditure at the sub-national level. Even China, they have a very high, about 70% of expenditure spent by subnational or local governments.
Is it because of the socialist country or I don't know?
We'll go into that later, but one possible explanation there is maybe the actual type of constitution is not a precondition for the degree of, say, fiscal decentralization of local governments in the country level. For example, in Latin American countries, the type of constitution, whether it's federal or unitary, may not be a precondition for the type or the degree of expenditure decentralization or revenue decentralization. That's one possible explanation, but I'll go into that in the country cases. Thank you. But some academics will laugh actually if they see that in, say, for example, in this particular country with a different kind of political system, how they have higher degree of, say, one type of decentralization, which is fiscal or administrative decentralization. In terms of political, I will not go into this, but I just summarize the work of UCLG. Administrative decentralization, looking at a number of countries. So, looking at, say, for example, the types of functions and responsibilities transferred to local governments. Again, you will see variations in terms of the number of functions transferred to local governments across countries. Say, for example, again, in the Philippines, planning is devolved or transferred, basic social services, health, water supply, but not electricity, not transport. And you look at Indonesia, almost all among these 8 functions are already devolved to local government. So what it shows simply is the variation of the functions transferred to subnational governments across countries. So in terms of directly comparing 2 countries, we have to look at individual peculiarities of countries before we really can compare. So to summarize, as a result of this particular set of slides, the studies in the early 2000s, as well as recent studies on attempts to measure the degree of decentralization, at best indicate the state of decentralization at a given time. It's still common to use traditional approaches to fiscal data, particularly coming from the IMF and the World Bank, and some use in-country data but with little updating. So if you look, for example, at the database of the World Bank, I think when I was doing the research, the most recent data was, I think, in 2001. After that, we could not get more comparative data. Same with that of the GFS, the government finance data from the IMF. So we really need to come up with our own local data to come up with our own new assessment or analysis. So current attempts do not actually measure the relative degree of change in intergovernmental balance of power or subnational government autonomy as a result of prior decentralization processes over time. This is more of my interest, trying to explain at the country level the extent to which institutional reforms, decentralization, affect or cause change in the outcome of interest, which is autonomy. And I'll show you the different independent processes that should explain the degree of change in intergovernmental balance of power in a particular country over a long period of time. Okay, so just to summarize again, it requires, based on this particular review, there is a need to conduct in-depth country study in explaining outcome of interest as a result of decentralization reforms, employing alternative measures, and data gathering approaches. So that's a challenge for us researchers and the students of public administration to generate new reliable data in coming up with new or building on existing knowledge and coming up with new alternative analysis. Okay? Do you have any questions so far? None? Shall we proceed? Okay. Okay, let me now go to our definition, at least for today, our definition of decentralization as a process and as a state reform. So it's a deliberate attempt to transfer intergovernmental balance of power, okay, from central to subnational governments. Okay. I adopt actually a definition by Tulia Faletti on decentralization as a process, where she defined it as a process of state reform comprising a set of public policies that transfer responsibilities, resources, and authority from higher to lower levels of government in the context of a specific type of state. So if you look into the definition more closely, it's more context specific. I mean, no, you can transport the definition into different contexts. Okay? So regardless of the type of state, sir, whether it's a socialist, federal, or a unitary, this particular definition of explaining the process may be useful. It involves three independent types of decentralization processes: administrative decentralization, fiscal decentralization, and political decentralization. And they are considered as continuing process rather than an end in itself. In other literature, you will find that decentralization is actually an end. That's the goal, to be decentralized. But in this definition, you look at three types of decentralization reforms as independent processes towards what? The transfer of intergovernmental balance of power. So it could increase or decrease autonomy of local governments. So this is a theoretical framework that I use in my research. Essentially, you look at these types of reforms, the three types of decentralization as independent processes that would result in, my outcome of interest is the intergovernmental balance of power or local government autonomy. But part of my process is to understand and explain the causal mechanisms that link our independent variable and dependent variable, and how the feedback effect is inputted into the mechanism. Okay, and then there are specific variables used for each independent process or type of reform. So for our definition, at least for today, of these types of reforms, here we define administrative decentralization as a set of public policies that transfer the dispensation and delivery of social services such as education, health, social welfare, and housing, etc. So, who will provide the service? Okay, transfer a set of public policies in providing that particular service. That's administrative decentralization here. And they could either be funded or not funded. Okay, either through fiscal transfer or it's just been transferred to local governments and you are responsible in generating your own revenues. And the professor here is looking at the taxes, right? In terms of local revenue collection. So from what you collect, you're responsible in delivering that particular service. So there's no need to be attached to a particular fiscal resource or transfer from central government. Another is fiscal decentralization. For this particular purpose, again, we define it as a set of policies designed to increase revenues or fiscal authority of subnational governments. Again, here, the idea is that as long as it increases subnational revenues, either through transfer of taxing authority or intergovernmental fiscal transfer, it's not really that much of a question. As long as you increase their revenues, that's part of fiscal decentralization for this purpose of study. The idea behind this is that when you have the resources at the local government level, to a certain extent, you have policy autonomy to make decisions on how to use that particular resource. So it's part of the autonomy of local governments or leaders of the local government if you have the money. And finally, political decentralization, it's more of the set of electoral reforms or electing local government officials directly or indirectly. That's part of that process. So it's either popular election of mayors or governors, creation of subnational legislative assemblies, and constitutional reforms to strengthen political autonomy. And as you all know, Indonesia went through this process over time, from 1999 to 2004, 2005, the direct elections, and subsequent reforms in 2009 and 2014. So, are we clear with the definition, at least for our purposes today, as a process? Because I don't want to distort or the other materials given to you, but I'm just providing a new set of information to help us better understand decentralization. Okay. May I drink my coffee?
Any question?
Pertanyaan dari sekalian? Ada pertanyaan? Mumpung lagi break kopi. Oke, silakan Prof. Mungkin biar lebih jelas.
Yes, sir. Please.
Thank you. Very sorry because I'm not expert in the public policy nor the fiscal policy, but I'm interested to discuss further about the process. It seems to me that in Philippines, the decentralization process is not so difficult. But here in Indonesia, the quarrel between the parliament and the very big issues at that time. Maybe I got the wrong impression, but it seems to me that in Indonesia, to decentralize the fiscal policy is not easy. Maybe in your country, because you didn't explain about how difficult to decentralize the fiscal policy. But here, even I'm not the expert in the fiscal or public policy, I saw the quarrel between the central government and the local government is very strong, was very strong at the time. I don't know whether in the Philippines easier process compared to ours.
Of course, it's not easy. But, sir, if I may just continue later, I will go answer your question through the presentation. But yes, again, it's part of the political process. It's not easy. In the Philippines, we had our decentralization law of 1991 after redemocratization when our authoritarian regime under Mr. Marcos was transitioned in 1986, 1987. We had our constitution in 1987. That's part of the initial process of redemocratization, including decentralization process, post-authoritarian regime. And then there were discussions, both in the upper house and the lower house, towards the development of the decentralization law, the local government code of 1991. And there were debates within lower house as well as the upper house, and it resulted in the adoption of the law. But yeah, in terms of the difficulty, it's not, I think, that difficult because it was not go. I think Senator Pimentel, our father of local government code, I mean the one who was part of the proponents of the decentralization law, would say that there was a golden opportunity to legislate a particular law. But the question now is, over time, since 1991, were there changes that happened so that there will be continuing reform in as far as transferring authority and responsibilities to local governments. In relation to Indonesia, I think you have had your own level of gradual increase in terms of transferring authority to local governments. From the first cycle, you have your subsequent second cycle and the third cycle. So far, I'll go into that certainly in the presentation, but although you have had your debates, but in the end, I think you had your share of results in terms of the transfer of more autonomy to local governments. Okay. And in explaining the process of change, I use the theory of the gradual theory of institutional change by Mahoney and Thelen in 2010. They say that there are four modes of institutional change. First is displacement, second is layering, drift, and conversion. And there are sets of institutional forms that could be here, so that it will institute change in terms of the degree of intergovernmental balance of power. I think Mr. Ichan is also using this particular theory in his study. But in this part, this is our own, as part of my research, in trying to define the elements that would really displace existing institutions. So what I'm saying here is, in relation to the theory, if you displace existing rules, for example, you have constitutional change, or you adopt a new decentralization law, there's a tendency to come up with a radical shift in terms of rules, formal rules, and the chance of increasing or decreasing substantially the balance of power. But when you talk of layering, it's really more of building on existing or amending rules. Drift is more of changing the impact as a result of shifts in the policy environment. So the policy environment simply changes, hence the degree of the measures will actually change also. And when you talk of conversion, according to Mahoney and Thelen, it's really more of reinterpreting existing rules by a credible authority. So when we talk of institutional reforms, these two, displacement and the layering, have more effect in terms of increasing or decreasing intergovernmental balance of power within the context of decentralization. Because it's either you have a radical shift, or you build on existing rules by coming up with new public policies, or you amend existing rules. Okay? So this I used in my research, trying to explain the process of change. Okay. Question. Okay, let me now go to the case as empirical evidence. Just a glimpse of what I tried to do in my research, looking at the two countries and drawing in within country inferences. Okay, so initially there was no attempt to compare the two countries, but rather look at the individual cases. Okay, so the main question really was what explains the degree of change in intergovernmental balance of power as a result of prior decentralization reforms. These are my research questions. The causes and consequences of decentralization leading to change in subnational local government autonomy. Second is when and how do institutional change occur after the first cycle has been completed? And finally, how can the degree of change in intergovernmental balance of power explain the trajectory or path of subsequent decentralization reforms? So, first cycle, how it happened, when and how, what's the explanation, and if there are subsequent reforms, how do we explain that? Okay? So in the Philippines, I will go into the details, but essentially, it's been argued that before 1987 and 1991, we had a very highly centralized administration. And 1987 Constitution, actually the revised Constitution, provided the guarantees for local autonomy, and of course the adoption of the local government law in 1991. It's been said that this is the far-reaching, most radical piece of legislation to develop the countryside. It's also been considered as there are problems of capacities and implementation between central and local governments. So, what are some of the findings? As a result of the first cycle of decentralization reform, we say that there was a medium to high degree of change from 1986 to 1998, immediately before and after the 1991 decentralization law. And the sequence of reforms are as follows: political decentralization, fiscal decentralization, and administrative decentralization. But in terms of the type or the mode of change in institutional form, I say that it's more of conversion, drift, in terms of administrative decentralization, there was some kind of layering. Okay? However, despite the fact that the countries, so in terms of interest that dominated, it was the subnational interest that dominated the process, but through national actors. So the subnational interest dominated the first round of reform, but it was driven by national actors, serving as representatives of local governments. Here, party coalition among territorial representatives was not existent. So, because in the theory, it says that parties, coalition, can influence the policy of change, but in the case of the Philippines, it was not really that significant. Okay, here are some measures comparing the 1987, 1991, and 1993, 1998 in terms of fiscal and administrative decentralization measures. From 91% in terms of revenue decentralization, it increased to some 17%. And if you look at expenditure decentralization, it increased from 6%, 7% to about 15%. So based on the measures, they indicate high degree of change in terms of fiscal and administrative decentralization, because I have very conservative metrics here. It's considered low if the change is 19% and below. If it's 39% to 20%, it's medium. But if it's 40% and up, it's considered high. So for the first cycle, between these two periods aggregated, I would say that we have a high degree of change. But if you look at it more closely, looking at it from, say, taxes, the transfer of tax authority, the findings indicate that the increase in fiscal decentralization was actually caused by the general purpose fund or grant, which is the internal revenue allotment. So it's really the fiscal transfers that increased fiscal decentralization in the Philippines, not more on the tax authorities being transferred to them. Okay? Okay? So it's really the transfers that allowed for such increase. We call it the internal revenue allowed. No or no substantial transfer in terms of taxing authorities. But of course, there's more predictability in terms of collection post-1991. Okay. We do not undermine that particular aspect. If you look at expenditure or administrative decentralization, again, it's considered high, and to a certain extent, it provided policy autonomy to local governments. So meaning local government officials, to a certain extent, they have more autonomy to make decisions. They have more policy autonomy and discretion in spending resources. However, the results do not actually reflect the real causes and consequences of decentralization reforms. So if you look at it historically, from 1960s to 2014, you will see the trajectory of the measures. One explanation of the high degree of change was because during the transition phase of post-authoritarian regime, there was the tendency to centralize political decentralization, political authority, even administrative responsibilities. Okay? Hence the high degree of change. But if you relate this with before the martial law, and even at a certain extent, in 1970s, the degree of change may be considered not that high, or low to medium. Okay, any questions so far? So let's to summarize the Philippine case, there was a high degree of change in the first cycle, but if you look at it from the perspective of comparing the immediate pre and post the decentralization law. But when you compare it before, much earlier, maybe we will have a different analysis. So what I'm saying here is part of the analysis, analytical process is you can go back in history in terms of doing your process tracing method. And what's important is you have an empirically observed trajectory where you could relate the observations and the events that happen over a long period of time. Okay? But in the final analysis, some existing or prior institutions have been path-dependent or self-reinforcing. However, it's very important that the legislation actually provided for a more predictable form of allocating resources between central and subnational governments. So let me now go very quickly to the Indonesia case. Overall, in the first cycle, the findings show high degree of change. And in terms of territorial interest, it was really the national interest to address the macroeconomic stability at that time, and of course, maintaining the territorial integrity of the state. In terms of the sequencing, initial partial political decentralization, administrative, fiscal, and then you have, in the subsequent cycle, you have another partial political decentralization wherein you already directly elected your local government officials. So it was really a process, more of a sequential process in the case of Indonesia. Very quickly, I'll not explain this because you all know this more than me. Administrative decentralization transferred 32 functions, over 2.6 million, etc. Personnel transferred mostly to local governments. Now we already inverted it from 12 to, it's really transferred, which also explains why local governments are spending more at the subnational level. Okay, going to fiscal decentralization, you have your own source revenues, intergovernmental fiscal transfers, and financing. If you look at the trajectory of your fiscal transfers, it's been increasing really over time since you had your decentralization law in early 90s, in late 90s. And you can also point out the change in the subsequent cycles of reforms. More fiscal transfers, specific grants in recent years. They are crowding out the black grants, but yes, it's changed also quite some improvements in terms of specific grants more than the black grants. In terms of local revenues, it's also changed over time. Local revenues are being crowded out by local revenues as well as other sources of revenues. If you look at the revenues vis-a-vis total revenue share, it's increased between 1998 and 2001, and it's somehow become stable over time. And if you look at the trajectory since the 80s, it's been this way in terms of fiscal decentralization, in terms of administrative decentralization or expenditure decentralization, it actually went up as 41%. Closer look, again, I will look at the tax transfers vis-a-vis of national central government. There has been a lot of improvements, but of course, it can be argued that local governments are not really collecting as much. And it's an issue of collection efficiency rather than by transferring the authority to collect taxes. So it also varies on the capacities of local governments. But in terms of transferring the authority, it's already there, but some are better than others. Or the other way around, I will not mention it. Okay, so yes, we look into this degree of changes, historical trend, as far as the 70s up to the recent years, and we can also detect when it changed historically over time and also periodized. So the overall findings indicate that in terms of sequence, partial, political, administrative, fiscal, and then you have also your political in 2015, and 2005, where you started electing. But of course, the election was also gradual, right? So now, by 2014, more or less you have achieved complete political, fiscal, administrative. Maybe it's time to assess whether it really affects or impact on economic growth, service delivery, even corruption and other areas. But before, while you're in the process, it's quite challenging whether who is more accountable. Is it central government or local governments? Okay. Causal inferences, displayed old rules, layering were present in subsequent institutional forms. I'll pass this, I'll skip this. So for a discussion and analysis, try to compare the two countries. Fiscal decentralization. I found in my research that fiscal decentralization, at least for this study, is actually not a very good measure for looking at autonomy because it's subject to some exogenous factors. No? It varies. But administrative or expenditure decentralization, I think, is more appropriate to measure the degree of autonomy. Okay, if you look at here, look at the Philippines, for example, blue, after the 1991 reform, we need more policies or institutional reforms to further increase that degree of decentralization. That's why in the Philippines now, there's been a lot of discussion in trying to change the constitution, changing or shifting from one type of system to another with the end in view of increasing more autonomy to local governments. because it's been more than 20 years, and there's this feeling that we have not really transferred a lot of authority or more authority to local governments. Again, with this analysis, there's no point of saying that the other one is performing better than the other, but in terms of transferring as a process of reform, there's been some variation or some kind of divergence, if you need. So this is periodization matters, so it's very important to periodize in your analysis, okay? Okay, I will end that presentation.
Okay.
I will close with this. It's a challenge for my closing remarks.
Not yet then.
I've used this in all my lectures as a closing remark, not as a conclusion of my presentation, but as a closing remark, not a conclusion of the study. Okay? This is not a conclusion, but a closing note. I've used this in all others because of the challenge of being prosodyo, echo, for us to come up with our own knowledge, particularly in coming up with more scholarship in Asian context. So that is the challenge for us students of public administration. How do we develop our knowledge based on the Asian context in terms of scholarship and policy relevant knowledge? Let's use interdisciplinary, collaborative research. You work with your colleagues in other departments, fiscal, governance, accountability, economists. You have to work together in understanding the process towards generating more information for policy, knowledge. Let's test, build theories from Asian context. Let's challenge existing theories developed elsewhere or build on them. I think that's the value of doing scholarship, to build on existing knowledge, and if existing theories are no longer relevant today, maybe we move on to the second generation theories. We are all aware that as far as decentralization is concerned, we have our first generation theories. These theories actually have moved on to the next second generation theories, including Owaits himself in 2006 already moved on to the second generation theory of decentralization. And I guess we're already moving on to the third generation theory, and the theory of, scholarship is very important here, so that we could relate decentralization vis-a-vis broad development outcomes such as corruption, decentralization, democratization, and even development and economic growth. And finally, let's use new methodologies and approaches to explain our studies. Let's use theory-centric, outcome-centric variants of new methods. And let's not forget, let's be based on empirical, observable data in detecting, coming up with our own analysis and inferences, guided by theories, frameworks, theories, and models. So with that, I will end my presentation. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
Thank you so much, Mas, for your mungkin ini merupakan kesempatan berharga buat adik-adik sekalian. Maksudnya ini jarang kita dapat tamu dari luar negeri ya, terutama untuk kelas ini, kelas pajak daerah ya Mbak Ina. Oke. Jadi saya ada yang ingin bertanya ya. Saya rasa ini menarik sekali studinya, mengkomparasi antara Filipina dan Indonesia ya dalam hal desentralisasi fiskal gitu ya. Jadi sebenarnya kita bisa melihat ada semacam persamaan dan perbedaannya juga gitu ya, dan begitu banyak lessons learned yang mungkin kita bisa aplikasikan gitu ya. Mengingat kedua negara ini adalah negara berkembang, penduduknya banyak, dan tentu saja tantangannya sangat besar gitu ya untuk mengadres isu-isu yang terkait dengan fiskal. Bagaimana? Ada yang bertanya? Bisa bahasa Indonesia? Hah? Mbak, tangannya bisa pakai bahasa Indonesia, nanti saya terjemahkan. Ayo. Ayo adik-adik sekalian. Hah? Jangan ini kesempatan yang langka ini. Gimana? Ah, itu dia, ada akhirnya, alhamdulillah. Minta pertanyaan aja, gitu ya.
Okay, my name is Muhammad Yusuf. I'm from Universitas of Indonesia, batch 2040. Actually, Mr. Jose, this question is from my lecture. Sorry, but I'm also interested about your presentation in Intergovernmental Fiscal Decentralization. I want to ask one question. It is about which better from decentralization government to be the decentralization between tax or transfer revenue in the decentralization concept. Thank you.
That's one question. Yang kedua gimana? Ada nggak? Hah? Oh, yeah, the question is, his question is, which one is better, yeah? Whether to decentralize the authority to collect tax or to make a fund transfer from the central government to local government directly. So it's the best option based on your study on those two countries, Indonesia and Philippines.
Okay. First of all, I did not look into that in my case, in my studies, because I didn't want to judge which is better, because we need more empirical research to do that. But what I tried to show here is the extent to which we have transferred authority. But there's another study that showed that in developing countries, central government has better administrative capability to collect revenues, and it has a wider view to redistribute it through fiscal transfers. But of course, it can also vary from country to country. But there is this viewpoint, school of thought, that central government has more administrative capability to collect, and within the context of allocative efficiency redistribution, it can assign where to put the resources in terms of allocative efficiency. But in the two countries, I have no direct answer as a result of my research, because what I'm looking at is by generating more analysis on the transfer, we can come up with more generalizable information rather than just comparing. We need more evidence to say which is better, this one or this one. But there is this guidance that yeah, central government has better administrative capability. But in terms of revenue autonomy, other practitioners or development practitioners would argue that you have to devote the collection of taxes. But from experience, we have to look at it how local governments perform in terms of collecting more revenues for the national government, okay, by transferring authority. Did I answer your question? So I cannot directly answer as a result of my study, but for me, as long as the money flows are spent by local governments, whether they collect it or whether it's collected by an intermediate level or national, through fiscal transfer. Actually, fiscal transfer is the instrument to allocate efficiently. Allocate efficiently to local governments.
Okay, thank you so much. Is there any questions? Okay, that's good. Tolong ini.
Okay, good afternoon, sir. My name is Rani. I would like to ask you about one thing. So, is there any requirements that have to be fulfilled by the subnational area to be able to run decentralization? Because I have read an article on the internet that there are several areas in Indonesia that propose to be legally appointed as autonomous region, but some of these proposals are cancelled. So, if yes, what are the requirements? Thank you.
Okay, Jose, you want to answer that? Could you repeat the question? Sorry. Nggak apa-apa, biar aja biar kedengeran.
Okay, so is there any requirements that have to be fulfilled by the subnational area to be able to run the decentralization? Because I have read an article on the internet that there are several areas in Indonesia that propose to be legally appointed as autonomous regions, but some of those proposals are cancelled by the central government. So if yes, what are the requirements? Thank you.
Terima kasih.
Are there requirements for subnational autonomy? If that's how you're going to frame the question, I would refer you back to the first generation theories of decentralization, which is subsidiarity, for example, meaning that services, for example, are best delivered at the lowest possible level, etc. But based again on my study, I'm not advocating, I'm not judging whether it's good or bad to decentralize or decentralize. I'm just looking at the process of transferring intergovernmental balance of power, and then eventually we can say what would be the optimal level of the degree of autonomy of local governments for them to be able to deliver a minimum level of services. So, if you go to other countries, for example, as long as local governments are able to deliver the same services to the constituents, that's fine, no? But they do not discuss much on providing them full autonomy and what level. So if you look at the cases here presented in terms of the variation of the degrees of autonomy, if you may, there's no uniform, actually there's no optimal level of autonomy that's been established that could tell us that by having this degree of autonomy, you have all the capacity to be able to deliver the services expected of a particular local government. So there's no, I don't know of any study, research-based, that could say that there is an optimal level of autonomy with the requirements, and that this particular, say, country or local governments, national governments are able to effectively collect revenues and deliver services as expected. So I think it's really more of searching for the right balance between central government and subnational government to be able to deliver adequately on the local authority. Of services.
Oke, ada pertanyaan lagi? Ayo, ini satu lagi deh. Nah. Berani. Coba, ini tinggal satu pertanyaan aja. Ada?
Bisa saya lagi.
Hah? Prof, apa?
Boleh.
Ya ada? Ah, ada. Oke, silakan ke depan deh.
Thank you for the opportunity to ask. Actually, I want to ask, before my name is Rahma, I want to ask if in Philippines decentralization is decrease the possibility of corrupt, because in Philippines is it decentralizations decrease the possibility of corrupt? Because in Indonesia, corruption, because in Indonesia, as I know, there's a lot of possibility of corruption when the central government transfers the government revenue to the local area. And then my second question is it decentralizations of fiscal for taking taxes, is it more effective used by the local governments to develop their area than to transfer their revenue from the central government? Thank you.
Again, that's why I conducted this study, because actually it's a challenge for academics. There were arguments before that by decentralizing, or even up to today, you increase the level of autonomy of local government officials, of accountability, I mean. By decentralizing powers to local government officials, local government institutions, you increase the level of accountability of local governments direct to the people. Isn't it? Because they will be directly elected, supposedly, and they are directly accountable to the electorate. That's the argument. But again, we have seen in empirical studies mixed results. There's no direct finding that would say decentralization really reduces, say, the level of. The question actually is that I can share with you as a result of the research is that the degree of autonomy as a result of the process should inform researchers and policymakers which level should be held accountable in terms of spending the resources. Because if much of the resources are still at the central level and they are the ones spending it for local governments, despite the decentralization law, isn't it that it should be central government should be held more accountable to the resources spent? Or in the case now of Indonesia, for example, now that you have more resources spent by central government, local governments, not really more, but you have increased it over time, how has this influenced the degree of corruption or low level of corruption? So I think now is the time for researchers to look at, say for example, in Indonesia, now that local governments have more resources to spend, they have more discretion, if you may. What is the empirical evidence today. More than the studies conducted, say, in 2001 or 2004, or even before that, because you just have achieved a higher level of autonomy after, say, 2014. So today is the best time to do research to be able to answer your question. In the case, say, for example, of Indonesia, has further decentralization increased or decreased the level of corruption? At which level? Central or subnational? Now that you have this level of autonomy. That's how I would respond to your question. Rather than generalizing without, just based on earlier arguments, and maybe you have not really transferred enough balance of power, and yet you are trying to hold subnational officials or local governments more accountable than central government.
Mbak Inat, you want to ask? And before gongnya Prof. Martani.
Okay, thank you for this opportunity. Okay, Prof. DJ, I want to tell you that in Indonesia context, we have a very complicated situation. There are various regency or city or province with a different condition. Very, there is a complex situation that we have faced the problem about the human resource. We have faced problem about everything, IT and so on. In my opinion, it's so difficult because we cannot find a general formula to make a policy about this fiscal decentralization in Indonesia, because we have to make several types of policy. Okay. And in my opinion, we need some indicator to clusterize or to grouping the same region with several regions with same condition with some indicator. Is it happen in Philippines? So because it's my concern, my main concern. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I guess we are talking about capacities of local governments. Yeah, we have indicators such as competitiveness of local governments. They're being rated in terms of competitiveness. If you have the national ease of doing business, you also do that at the subnational level. You rate local governments in terms of competitiveness. That's one. Another is there are also very good local governments. Of course, there are also some problems, just like in countries like start local governments, like Galipot or others, who were given the authority and the chance to really become innovative, if you may. So that's not debatable. With the enabling policy framework, some have really performed better, others are better than others. Okay, but indicators, yeah, we also have this program of, we call it Seal of Good Housekeeping, wherein good performing local governments in terms of good local governance. They are transparent, they post their budget online, etc. No? And then once you have the seal of good housekeeping, you put your house in order in terms of accountability, transparency, participation, the elements of good governance. They are given incentive, say grants, performance grants, so that they would have more resources to deliver services. So this is another indicators for local governments, or incentives, if you may, for them to perform better. But yeah, in as far as the enabling law is concerned, particularly the cities are performing much better because they have more resources to spend. and they really have the capability to do that. But these are the two things that I can share with you now. One is the seal of good housekeeping, where all local governments are rated by the Ministry of Interior and Local Government, Department of Interior. And then if you have this seal, then you are eligible for grants for specific, incentivize, if you may, performance. And of course, there's an ongoing training capacity building for local governments. That's our case.
For the last question, I will give an honor for Professor Martani, because he was also a former Director General in the Fisheries Department, so he knows every detail inside out of the Indonesian government, so he's also practitioners. Please, Pak.
Thank you, guys. Dr. Tiu Sonco, this is very inspiring lecture for us. But for the last question, it's a bit a silly question. Back to the conclusion remark number 3. Could you, number 3? Yes. It seems to me that the successful of the decentralization can be correlated with the corruption, decentralization, and democratization development in these two countries. Because if you put the point between the Suharto's period and then Ferdinand Marcos period, if we compare, it means that the democratization happened after Ferdinand Marcos and then Corazon Aquino, right? That's the process of democratization took place successfully. Also in Indonesia, after the Suharto's period, and then the democratization happened smoothly. Can be correlated with the number 3 closing remarks about my observation, because of these two leaders finished their the authorization finished, and then democratization happened. I don't know, this is my conclusion, personal conclusion. Thank you very much.
Do you want me to respond? Well, actually, that's one of the reasons why I also selected the two countries. No? We almost followed through the same phases, if you may, in as far as transition. No? And it was not that difficult in your case, not difficult in the Philippines in the first cycle of reforms. And part of the explanation, I guess, is that there was really that transition phase. No? But the reason why I also did the study is because past literature would always associate decentralization with democratization. So without democratization, there is no decentralization. Analytically, at least for the research, I tried to dissociate the very broad, because it unfolded together with, right, with the democratization process. So that's to be very objective in the analysis, dissociated it with the overall policy, the overall environment, that's how I like to see it, sir. To dissociate that even with, regardless of the type of constitution, if you may, or system of government, there could have been processes that already evolved in as far as decentralization is concerned. That's one possible way. Second is, that's a challenge. Now that you're able to have this kind of alternative views, can we say that high degree of decentralization or intergovernmental balance of power lead to better democracy. We have democratization in this aspect. In as much as they're also asking the question, does democracy lead to economic growth and high levels of income? Now, we reverse the question. Does increased autonomy of local governments lead to democratization or low levels of democratization? It's more hypothetical. That's why I'm looking at this. Even with corruption, does increased autonomy of local governments lead to high or lower level at the subnational level? Then we prove it empirically. But now we already have a basis to say a certain degree of autonomy. That's why in the first slide, we highlighted this argument. The need to determine and explain the extent of or degree of decentralization is very critical.
Okay, thank you so much for your presentation. Give a round of applause last time for Dr. Jose. Thank you very much for your presentation, your knowledge sharing. I mean, we really find it very useful for us. So hope that all these students will learn a lot from this. And we're hoping that you also have a good time sharing your knowledge with our students as well as our lecture in via Thank you so much again.